remark. Over to Mr. Balaji.
Yeah, can you go to the slide? I think first of all, thank you for joining the call. This is Balaji. I had the IMEA region for Momentive. It has been a great effort. Probably could have been better, but after our outreach, if you look at from 18 and 20, I think this is a full house type of discussion, right? I think which is going to help us. The objective, right? And as we talk about anything which has a potential to have an impact, an harmful effect. It's about source. It's about the kind of exposure and also kind of hazard, right? I think that's basic fundamental as you talk about risk-based approach. So what we are trying to look at from part of this meeting as an objectives is to how do we establish a platform not only by qualitative thinking, and it's also our scientific engagement, especially around the India risk-based approach. What could be the better one in terms of chemical management? As part of the process, how do we engage and get the right expert opinion, right? And that's what we're trying to do. As we try to do, we are also trying to look at how do we develop, right, the best tools and models. One is through experience, the other is through read and also practically do from a chemical risk assessment side. And then as we do that, and then also look at how does it apply and how do we assess those things at the end of the day, how it is going to benefit, right? And also look at is there anything else we can do more. I think those are the meeting objectives. As I said, we took additional time. We did a good in-person outreach in 2018, followed by 2020, just before the pandemic. And we thought we will get back again the year after, but which did not happen. But I still remember, Betsy, me, Jagmeet, a lot of us coming into NEERI's office, and we had a very engageful and fruitful discussions. And what further to that, I think from here, in this session in today, I think I expect active participation, sharing across, and also active conversations, which is going to take it forward. From a risk-based approach, how do we look at addressing at the source point, looking at the number of exposure, amount of exposure, and also hazards associated with it. That's a small introduction, and happy to be part of the discussion and also along with the team. Thank you. Over to you, Noor. You're on mute. Yeah.
Thank you, Balaji. Mr. Balaji, for your introductory remark and about this workshop, and surely we will be working together for this important cause. Moving ahead, I would now like to invite our director, Dr. A.N. Ved, to give his inaugural address and overview about the Indian scenario, policies, and practices. Dr. Ved took the charge of CSIR-NEERI on November 2021. Before becoming the director, Dr. was chief scientist and head of Chennai Chemical and Hazardous Waste Management Division. He has a vast experience in all fields of environmental sciences and engineering, especially in solid and hazardous waste management. Dr. Ved has extensively been involved in quantification and characterization of solid and hazardous waste, designing of secure landfill, ecotoxicological studies on landfill leachate management, and many such related studies in this field. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Noor. Thank you, GSC, Global Silicon Council. On behalf of CSIR-NEERI, I welcome all participants offshore as well as from India. Good morning to all American participants, and good evening or good afternoon to my Indian colleagues. And I see our seniors also, former scientists of NEERI who are who were actively and still are actively involved into such deliberations and research. So this is regarding the exploring the science, and it's a very important thing. Exploring the science of risk-based approach for chemicals and assessments and management. Now, it's an inaugural address. I would like to skip the presentations as such because it will be a lot of repetitions. I would like to give stress on few points from Indian context and Indian point of view. Basically, as we know, the first point is that chemicals is an essential part of life and essential part of economy. And there is no point in denying the fact that we will have to handle chemicals this way or that way. So it's an inevitable thing, and we cannot avoid chemicals handling, chemical use in practice, in industry, and in all commercial applications. And not only that, chemicals are present in different matrices. It's not the question whether chemical is available in pure form or this form or compounds. It is available along with other chemicals in different compounds in different products. And therefore, the matter is not very simple as it appears for a pure chemical. What we are actually dealing with the matrix of chemicals, matrix of other compounds, where the chemicals with different levels of toxicity, different levels of risks are actually accumulated or present. And therefore, it's very complicated subject in a way, because the way chemicals are released into environment or into any receiving source, it totally depends on the overall property of that matrix where it is present. The first thing which I would like to emphasize is that analysis of the chemicals in different matrices. That is a very important aspect of anything, because with risk-based analysis also, or with whatever analysis we do, we will turn out and we will come out with certain concentrations. But how to measure those concentrations, that becomes a prime thing, and that will remain a prime thing. And it has to be standardized across the globe. It is not only across the India, it should be internationally acceptable to all those who are using this chemical. And therefore, one of the aspects this workshop should cover is also, if not today, in coming workshops or series, is the analysis of chemicals of concern in different matrices, and to the what accuracy and what levels that can be decided based on that. Number two is that we are looking for the norms. And if you go through the draft, still for this particular association, we have been working, or we have been discussing this since 2018, I think. And then we were about to actually flag off, but then 2 years of pandemic, and then we were delayed quite a lot. Anyway, nevertheless, finally we are into position to hold this first workshop, so that is a good sign. Another aspect which we have to cover is we need to have standards for discharge. There are one or two things. One is standards for discharge. If we want to phase out certain chemical, or if we want to deal out with some remediation tasks of some chemicals, then again we have to settle down at some target levels of remediation, target levels of release, for which how to decide target levels of remediation, target levels of discharge or norms. Everywhere it will be always a risk-based approach which will be adopted. And it cannot be a simple approach or simple concentration which is arrived at by old type of methodologies like toxicology, LD50 or LD, those kinds of things which were preliminary in toxicology. Everywhere it has to be now risk-based. And whatever concentrations, even for workplace standards also, if we are developing certain standards for workplace, for chemicals, it has to be a risk-based standard again. And for remediation, for discharge of waste, for anything, even for phasing out chemicals, whatever we are dealing, the management of chemicals right from cradle to grave, we need some standards. We need to have some concentrations. Those concentrations, safe concentrations, are to be arrived at on the basis of risk-based approach. And therefore, I think this is a very important seminar, the kind of first step in this collaboration which we discussed. Since Global Silicon Council is involved, I think there is a move to put siloxanes into annexure C or B of Stockholm Convention as POPs. Now the question again is that it's not siloxane only, and because Global Silicon Council is involved, it is generally for any chemicals which we are dealing with. So these chemicals are the, you can say, the international community, or it will be always dealing with some chemicals under some framework of some convention, wherever the standard methodologies are required. And then when I say I deal with some chemical and some standards of chemicals, I need to have an internationally acceptable methodology to arrive at those concentration standards. And therefore, we must know a science behind this. And it's a multidisciplinary science. It's not only single, it's not a chemistry, or it's not analysis, or it's not physics, or it's not engineering. It is a multidisciplinary science which is involved into that. Probably even health aspects are to be taken into consideration, human physiology, and even the receptor model of the source, like Balaji has said, there is a source, there is the exposure, and then there is a receptor. And we have to arrive at standard considering all these aspects right from A to Z. And therefore, I think a proper methodology and proper understanding of the basic science behind this is very essential. And I'm sure that this webinar would deliberate on the different aspects of these basic sciences which are involved in the risk-based management. Because ultimately, we need some tools to manage the management of chemical is inevitable. As I said in the beginning, we have to deal with chemicals. And if you look at all the standards, all the conventions across the nations, even the draft standards which are there for India for chemicals management, it all talks about risk-based standards or risk-based management. Also, there is initial list of some few 900 or 1000 chemicals, which is initial list, and it may go to 2000, 3000 like that. So you can see when the standards are in place, whenever they are in place, it's a huge task to get the data, and there has to be a very good and common methodology, which is of which is acceptable and which will lead to the correct standards of any chemicals. A general thought comes to my mind that I am basically chemical engineer, and when we were learning in our mathematics in second year or third year, at that time computers were or models were not available. So for partial differential equations, we used to have to very common. There used to be one general solution and one particular solution. So for a given differential equation, there will be a general solution plus particular solution for that particular thing. So we need, and this is a methodology which we have to arrive at for chemical. There has to be a general methodology applicable to all chemicals, and depending on the property of that particular chemical, you can have particular additions to that. And that way we can arrive at standards or anything which we want to arrive at by risk-based approach for the chemicals. And list of chemicals is not restricted to POPs or siloxanes or silicon chemicals. It can be anything, and it is going to be ever expanding. And whether we are equipped to deal with this, I am doubtful. We need a lot of efforts for that from Indian side also, from scientific side also. And we have to look for collective capabilities. We have to look for collaborations across the world, across the borders. And even within India also, we have to use the wisdom of all people who have worked in this area. And therefore, I think this is a very good, this is going to be a very good start kickoff workshop for this particular endeavor. And I see many speakers who have different levels of experiences, and they're putting a lot of efforts into this chemicals management this way or that way. And I expect to arrive at, or I expect to get some kind of basic methodology out of this seminar, at least glimpse of that or outline of that. And if we can get pin down to that, that will be a great success for this seminar. With these few words, I stop here, and I wish all the best to all speakers, and it will be a fruitful interaction, I'm very sure about. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir, for giving your inaugural address and a briefing point regarding the risk-based approach of the chemical that we are going to study in this collaborations. Thank you so much, sir. We are now having Mr. Carlos Thomas from GSC with us. Mr. Thomas is an executive director at Global Silicon Council. He coordinates international advocacy for the silicon industries in consultation with the Regional Silicon Industry Association in North America, Europe, and Japan. He is also responsible for the development and implementation of legislative, regulatory, and scientific policy advocacy on behalf of the North American silicon industries. He will give an overview about the global approach to chemical management. Over to Mr. Thomas.
Thank you very much. And on behalf of the Global Silicones Council, I'd like to welcome everyone to this seminar, and a special thanks to NEERI for developing and entering into this collaboration with us, and Dr. Goyal and Dr. Vasia in particular. Really appreciate all of your help and support. To start, I'm just going to give a really brief overview of the Global Silicones Council for those that are not maybe as familiar with the organization. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about approaches to global's chemicals management. There are two what I would consider philosophical approaches to chemicals management. One is a hazard-based approach, the other is a risk-based approach, and I'll talk about those very generally because I know speakers during the technical sessions are going to talk about those in a lot more detail. Next slide. So the Global Silicones Council is a trade association. We are comprised of companies that produce and market silicones internationally. Our members are listed here. Elcom Silicones, Dow Performance Silicones, Evonik Corporation, Momentive Performance Materials, Shinitsu Silicones, and also Wacker Chemical Corporation. And our mission is really to promote the safe use of silicones through product stewardship and environmental health and safety research. There's also a huge component of our advocacy that involves outreach around chemicals management generally, and I think that's the pretext around that we're having this collaboration and this initial seminar. Next slide, Betsy. So this is just an overview of our structure. As was mentioned initially, the Global Silicones Council is comprised of 3 silicone industry associations, one in North America, the Silicones Health and Environmental Safety Council, which is a part of the American Chemistry Council. And then there's also CES, which is Silicones Europe, which is a part of CEFIC, which is the Chemical Industry Association of Europe, and then also the Silicone Industry Association of Japan. Next slide. And again, just wanted to give a really brief overview of these competing approaches to international chemicals management. The one which I know folks are going to be very familiar with is the hazard-based approach, which is precautionary in nature. There is a reliance in a lot of instances on using laboratory techniques which are intended for screening, but to use those for regulatory decision-making, which I don't think was their intended purpose. This approach also minimizes the influence of exposure for certain endpoints or impacts or characteristics, such as persistent bioaccumulative toxic substances, persistent mobile and toxic substances, endocrine active compounds. In some cases, there's also this hazard-based approach for carcinogen. And the one, it could jeopardize innovation. It also constrains the availability of substances for environmental sustainability and carbon neutrality policy goals without necessarily any human health or environmental benefit. Next slide, Betsy. The risk-based approach, which I've heard a lot of support for, which is encouraging. The real benefits to this risk-based approach are there's an attempt to simulate real-world behavior of chemicals without relying exclusively on laboratory techniques. And then these laboratory techniques are used for screening and prioritization as opposed to regulatory decision-making. Another feature of a risk-based approach is that hazard and exposure are both considered for determination of risk. Some of the benefits of a hazard-based approach are really facilitates economic growth, technological innovation, and it also preserves the ability of having substances available to really support countries like India's environmental sustainability and carbon neutrality policy goals. Next slide, Betsy. So this is just an overview of a risk-based approach. And again, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here because I know speakers during the technical session are going to cover this in way more detail. And then during our session that we will hopefully be able to plan for next year, we'll go into even more detail. But the initial step is a hazard identification or problem formulation. From there, there's consideration of both hazard and exposure. And then there's a risk characterization. And ultimately, if there is a need, there's risk management. An ongoing part of all of this, as you see to the right, is this whole data acquisition and verification phase, which really allows the use of new information or updated information to inform all of the elements of the risk-based approach. Next slide, Betsy. And here I just wanted to give a little bit of an overview of some of the differences between a risk-based approach and a hazard-based approach. There is a lot of similarity, but Betsy, if you could hit it one more time. So one of the key differences between a hazard-based approach and a risk-based approach, during the evaluation of hazard, as I mentioned before, screening techniques are used to identify some of these other characteristics or impacts like PBTs, PMT, and endocrine active compounds. Hit it one more time, Betsy. And as a consequence, if some of these screening techniques identify a compound as a PBT, a PMT, or an endocrine active compound, then there is no consideration of exposure. There is also no risk characterization done. I hit it one more time, Betsy. So you go ultimately to risk management. So I think that's one of the key differences that I wanted to highlight here with respect to one of the shortcomings of a hazard-based approach is it really disallows consideration of exposure, and it does not allow risk characterization for compounds that have these, what I would call, unique considerations like PBTs, PMTs, endocrine active compounds. I think the science is such that you can do an exposure evaluation and a risk characterization for all of these characteristics. I think in some quarters you have heard these characteristics described as hazards. I think from our perspective, at least for persistence and bioaccumulation and also mobility, I think a lot of folks would describe those as exposure characteristics and not necessarily hazards. And that also reinforces the need to consider exposure. So next, final slide, Betsy. So I think just to kind of wrap it all up, why is understanding and using risk assessment important? Because one might assume that there's no harm in actually pursuing risk management when there is no real risk and only hazards. But I think one of the things that we wanted to be clear about is that there are some negative implications of pursuing this approach, in addition to those that I highlighted before. Among those are you could essentially replace a well-studied compound or product with one that has less information and much less known about it. So you could ultimately have more risk, but not be aware of it because there's a lot less information. Another potential negative consequence is you could have end up replacing a product with physical chemical parameters from laboratory studies that trip a so-called hazard like PBT, but don't behave this way in the actual environment. And I think that further emphasizes the point that I was trying to make earlier, which is that these screening studies should really be used for screening for these particular characteristics like PBTs and not be used for regulatory decision making. Another potential consequence is that you could replace a product that has little or no exposure with one that actually has much more environmental exposure. So the overall sort of take home is that all consequences of regulatory programs that only consider hazard is going to be fraught with a number of uncertainties that could ultimately lead to more problems than you anticipated. So I'll stop there and see if there are any questions. And if not, we can move on to the next speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Thomas, for sharing your working practice and telling us about the Global Silica Council advocacy structures and briefing us about the important international approach for the chemical management. Also, you have very well explained about the importance of risk assessment for the new chemicals that we have to approach in. In this session, thank you so much. In this session, our next speaker was from CPCB, but due to the prevailing environmental issues, he could not make himself available for this webinar. But we will definitely be able to hear him in our next physical workshop. With this, we come to an end of our introductory and overview session. In our next technical session, I will invite my colleague, Engineer Ankit Gupta, to take forward this session. Over to Ankit.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Noor. So as we all are aware that chemical regulations exist to ensure that chemicals do not poses any significant threat to humans or environmental health throughout the chemical's entire life cycle, may it be manufacturing, intended use phase, or disposal. In continuation to this, we move to our next technical session, where we will be joined by 3 distinguished speakers who are experts in risk-based chemicals assessment, and they would be speaking on related topics related to sources, exposure, hazard evaluation, and risk characterization. Without further ado, I would like to invite our first distinguished speaker, Dr. Chitra Rajgopal. Dr. Chitra Rajgopal is Director, Center of Excellence in Process Safety and Risk Management at IIT Delhi. A distinguished scientist, Dr. Chitra held the post of Director General Resource and Management in DRDO till December 2020. Before taking this charge, she was Outstanding Scientist and Director, Center for Fire, Explosive, Environmental Safety, where she spent substantial time of her career in R&D on explosives, fire, and environmental safety for MOD applications, and which she played a key role in setting up and nurturing. Now I would directly invite Dr. Chitra to deliver her distinguished address. Over to you, ma'am.
I think she is mute. Huh?
Ma'am, you are muted.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Right.
I just want to add on this. Since this session was planned for 15 minutes, but our one of this speakers from CPCB is not there. So, madam, you can take 15 to 25 minutes for your talk. Thank you so much.
Is my slide visible?
Yes.
In the full screen mode?
Yeah, it is in the full screen.
So thank you for the nice introduction. And I think my previous speaker has made my job easier. He has given a complete overview of both the hazard and risk-based approaches. And in fact, I will start with covering a little bit about chemical hazards and their characterization, the global scenario. You may be aware there are about 100,000 chemicals on the market, and out of these, only 500 chemicals have been extensively characterized for their hazards and exposures. 10,000 more fairly well characterized, 20,000 with limited characterization, and 70,000 chemicals with poor characterization. And if we look at India, we produce and store more than 3,000 hazardous chemicals, and we have more than 1,900 major accident hazard units, and several million registered hazard factories which fall below the criteria for maximum accident hazard. And we have also thousands of factories in the unorganized sector, which deal with numerous chemicals posing serious disaster risks. In fact, many of them have led to accidents. These are some of the accidents which have happened post-Bhopal, leading to a lot of fatalities, injuries, as well as impacts on the environment. This is 2014 up to 2014. And then these are the very recent accidents which have happened, which involve explosions, fires, toxic releases, dealing with various chemicals. So if we have an hazardous incident of this form, what we basically end up with is reviewing and updating the risk assessment. And in this, we start first with the chemical exposures, that is what kind of human health and environment exposures are there, what is the emissions, what is the fate in all the media, what are the personal exposures, the dose to target tissues, hazard identification, and then the dose response, risk characterization, and finally risk management. So let's look at chemical risk assessment first, basically understanding the nature, magnitude, and probability of a potential adverse health or environmental effect. And this used to form the foundation of regulatory decisions for all industrial chemicals, pesticides in the developed world. Now we are looking at a risk-based approach, where after hazard characterization and exposure assessment, we do a risk characterization. And then here we look at exposure over the no effect level and see whether this value is, what is the value of this? So if it is less than 1, then yes, we can accept it and then we can go ahead and just document it. But if it is higher, then we need to iterate and see how we can bring down the levels. So in the risk assessment, first we do the hazard, there is dose response characterization, then the exposure assessment, and then the risk characterization where we combine the information from both of them so that we can have a conclusion about the nature and magnitude of the risk and whether we need to implement additional risk management measures. So this is the detailed hazard characterization both for human health and for environment. Now, for a chemical process plant, what is it which happens when we handle a chemical? What are the hazards? We do a hazard screening. In addition to the intrinsic hazards of the chemical, we also need to know what are the operating conditions under which the chemical is handled. And then what is the kind of plant layout? What are the equipment specifications, the process description? And then we carry out for a hazard identification for potential incidents. And then what are the potential consequences in terms of we do a source modeling, what are the kind of congestion, confinement, and then the population. What is the impact assessment? What is the vulnerability? What kind of population is getting exposed? And then human reliability when failure rates come in. And then the likelihood evaluation. And finally, risk estimate, where we do a quantitative risk assessment. We look at various protective layers and then whether they are, what is the efficacy of these protective layers, and finally come on to the value of risk. Once we assess the risk, we need to see how to control the risk and then record the assessment, and we continue to review the control measures. So India, we need to adopt risk acceptance criteria relating to major chemicals and hazard industries as we attempt to transform into a major global economy. But then how low should this risk be? Because this provides a regulatory legal support, and this needs to be established and enforced by the government so that any kind of risk is controlled to below this level. So the principles for establishing risk acceptance criteria, one could be an absolute criteria, that is a single risk level, which divides tolerable risk from intolerable level, or a LARP, as low as reasonably practicable. Here we set two limits, unacceptable risk and acceptable risk. And if it is found to lie between these two, we do a cost benefit analysis. And then GAMAB, which means globally at least as good. That means we compare it with an existing system, and if it is at least equal to or less than the risk of an existing system, we accept it. Then an MEM, minimum endogenous mortality. So there should not be a significant increase in the individual risk per annum to any person. And then a precautionary principle. That means a lack of a full scientific certainty shall not be used as a reason for postponing cost-effective measures to prevent environmental degradation. The other principle of maximum benefit to all, basically the total expected net benefit to society should be maximized. And the other approach is no mandatory risk reduction measures. We just rely on market forces, and we assume that they'll get competently managed through those. Out of all of these, the ALAP principle has found the widest favor among both regulators and other stakeholders, and is a function of both the risk and implicit cost of risk reduction. And these dual risk levels of acceptable risk limit and unacceptable risk limit, these are derived or extracted from historical and empirical data. Now we have an individual risk criteria and a societal risk criteria. So when we look at both of these, we have, if we look at the risk criteria from various countries, you can see there is an unacceptable risk level and an acceptable risk level. Similarly for societal risk, when we talk of societal risk, it is the measure of risk faced by groups of people within the exposed population. And this is generally represented by frequency fatality N curves. And here, as you can see, this is the frequency of the accident. It could be 10 raised to minus 3, 10 raised to minus 2 per year. And this whole region is negligible risk. This is as low as reasonably practicable, and this is intolerable risk. And within this region, we see whether through cost-benefit analysis, what can be done. Now, the slope of this curve, the FN curve, represents the degree of aversion to multi-fatality events. When this is more negative than -1, then the risk criteria is termed as more risk averse. And higher slopes indicate more stringent risk controls. And these are the societal risks for selected countries. Now, how do we say what is the acceptability of a calculated risk? Once we have calculated the risk, that is the risk assessed, we see where it lies. If it is already within the acceptable region, then we do not have to do anything. If it is in a region which is unacceptable but can be brought down with certain measures, say deterministic measures, then again it comes down to the acceptable level. Or we may need to bring in both probabilistic and deterministic measures to bring into the acceptable criteria. Sometimes both with preventive and protective measures, we may still be left with a gap. Now, the other concept of ALAP principle, which I had said about the cost-benefit analysis, if we plot this risk versus cost-benefit, there is a point at which this matches. The level of risk is brought down sufficiently, and the costs are not too high. So this is the optimal level. Now we look at controlling the risks. How do we bring it down? As I said, you can either eliminate or you can substitute. That means instead of a chemical which is, let us say, very hazardous, you can replace it, or you can replace a process using a physical process rather than a chemical process. And substitution, as I said, in case you have, for example, water-based paint instead of an organic solvent-based paint, using hazardous substance in paste or pellet form rather than a dusty powder. Isolation, this means separation of the process from people by distance or use of barriers. Engineering controls, that means which minimize the generation of a hazardous substance or include enclosures, partial enclosures. Administrative controls, these are work practices so that people work in safer ways and are limited, the extent of exposure is limited. So this is some examples of friendly systems where we can minimize the risk by intensification. We used to earlier manufacture nitroglycerine, for example, by a batch process, but then it was changed to a continuous process. So the inventory of the material is much lower. So in case of an accident, the amount to which a person is exposed is reduced. Then substitution, non-flammable solvents, for example, chlorinated solvents are non-flammable in nature. Heat transfer media, for example, you can substitute eutectic mixtures of diphenyl oxides instead of flammable heat transfer media. Attenuation, you can store liquefied gases in a refrigerated rather than a pressurized condition. You can handle slurry instead of dried powders, and so on and so forth. There are various ways by which you can design friendly systems. Then, of course, if nothing else, then you have personal protective measures to safeguard the health until such time as adequate control is achieved by other means. Now let's look at a little bit of the national and international initiatives. As you know, we had the manufacture, storage and import of hazardous chemicals rule in India. And we had a large number of hazardous chemicals where the principal objective was to prevent major accidents, and we had a number of low-level, medium-level, and high-level controls, depending on what is the inventory of chemicals stored by the occupier. Then we had the International Register of Potentially Toxic Chemicals, which was following a recommendation of the 1972 UN Conference on Human Environment. And this again aimed to help the world community to make better use of the existing global resources and an information base to manage chemicals effectively. Then now we have a REACH system which aims to improve the protection of human health and environment through better and easier identification of the intrinsic properties of the chemical substances. So now we have an India REACH. There's a 5th draft was released and it is expected to be published now. This will replace the manufacture, storage and import of hazardous chemicals rules and the chemical accidents rules of 1996. This will apply to all substances and mixtures and articles and intermediates. And there are various processes. What are the requirements for different inventories? If it is less than 1 ton per annum, 10 ton, less than, that should be less than 10 tons per annum, less than 1,000 tons per annum, and greater than that. Let's look at some international interventions. If there is time, I can continue. Do we have some more time or?
Yes, ma'am, you can take 5 minutes.
All right. So the international EU policy, for example, it looks at safe and sustainable by design criteria. And here we use knowledge sharing networks, financial support, mapping skill mismatches so that people can be trained, and then ensuring legislation. And then using non-toxic material cycles, develop methodologies for chemical risk assessment that consider the whole life cycle of the substances, innovative industrial production, greening and digitalizing production of chemicals, and protection against harmful chemicals. Then if you look at the American Chemical Society recommendations, it says information about risk and hazard which has been assessed should be widely, transparently and publicly available. It should be based on the evaluation of chemical safety should be based on robust, reproducible science and risk-based criteria. And a scientific process requiring this should require inputs from researchers, regulators, consumers, and manufacturers. The government and industry play critical roles in the both assessment and regulation. The other issue is of standardization and harmonization of hazard criteria and risk assessment language. And when we take risk management decisions, we should consider vulnerable populations and availability of appropriate chemical analogs, substitutes, potential interactions, potential informational transformations, and so on. And whatever evaluation you do and recommendations, we should revisit at regular intervals. So the current assessment, hazard assessment of approach has certain limitations. We are limited and hampered by non-availability of test data and the time required to evaluate test data, lack of methods for initial hazard identification, and enormous resources are required to implement animal-based testing paradigm at larger scale. So we need to shift away from that towards a hypothesis-based approach. And QSIR application toolbox has been propagated by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And this uses both categories approach and it reduces the need for animal testing. And this has the advantage that all the chemicals can be assessed from intrinsic hazards regardless of the amount of data available. And the categories approach will greatly reduce testing of chemicals which pose low hazards and of chemicals which are similar to other chemicals. So we can use an analogous approach. Now I'd like to end by giving you a little bit of overview about our Center of Excellence in Process Safety and Risk Management in IIT Delhi. This was set up primarily to meet the safety challenges and promote commercial safe use of hazardous chemicals and processes. And we came together, that is IIT Delhi was the academic partner, with the FIT Foundation for Innovation Technology Transfer, FITT in IIT Delhi, Yexcon Norway, who is a knowledge partner, and Naira Energy, who is our industry partner. And our vision was to set up a process safety institute to provide facilitated tools, both to analyze and minimize chemical accidents. And also our mission is to promote process safety, human capacity building through training, education, conduct research in the safety of both chemicals, renewables with a focus on hydrogen, and develop safety protocols and standards in line with international norms and best practices. So we have various verticals, the R&D vertical, the consultancy, capacity building and development of safety standards. We're also looking at developing and maintaining a database of accidents with root cause analysis. We have a computational facility already set up, and we have various software for CFD modeling of various scenarios, accident scenarios, fires, explosions, toxic releases. And we are also looking at VR visualization for risk communication and training. So this is a very powerful toolbox which can be used for training, safety training and risk communication to first responders. And here also lessons learned from incidents and accidents. And to also demonstrate what went wrong and how mitigation could have prevented the accidents from happening. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. I think it was really a wonderful talk, and it was very enlightening to know such details of chemical characterization, chemical risk assessment, safety management systems, national and global initiatives which have been taken, including the limitations on the current approaches, hazard characterizations. You also elaborated detailed on societal individual risk FM curves. And we are also delighted to know that IIT Delhi, along with FIT, has taken such an initiative to set up the Center of Excellence. Thank you very much, ma'am. Now we'll take up questions at the end of this session, ma'am. So anybody who has questions may please post on chat. Now we move to our second distinguished speaker, Dr. K. Plotsky. Dr. Kathleen Plotsky is a chief health and environment scientist for consumer solutions at Dow Chemical Company. Her area of scientific interest includes distribution, fate, and effects of chemical in body and environment. Her current research efforts have focused on incorporating new scientific tools and intelligent testing designs to assess the sustainability of chemicals in the environment. Over to you, Doctor.
Okay.
So we have slight liberty of time, so you can also extend by 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you. And Betsy, are you going to run or?
I am trying to get to share. Let me just want to make sure I can do this.
Okay.
For some reason, it's not sharing. It was doing it fine before.
I can do.
There we go. Let me try this one.
Okay.
Yep, here you go. Sorry about that.
That's okay. That's all right.
Let me get into presentation mode. There you go.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation to present here today. And I think that it's been already a very good discussion about how we approach the assessment of chemicals. And I look forward to our continued discussion and going a little bit deeper into some of these areas. So my talk today is again just focused on the use of risk as the basis for chemical assessment and management. It will touch upon a few highlights of some of the learnings that I'd say that we've had and that I've had throughout my career in some of the methodology that we've used in doing chemical risk assessment. So next slide. So I think it's always important to start out, and we've had a lot of discussion about hazard versus risk. And sometimes it's easier if we put it into context of something that we're thinking about in a daily aspect of our life, or at some point in our life when we're out there in the world and not just around chemicals. So if you go ahead and click, Betsy. Risk is really a function of both hazard and exposure. And it's how we look at that hazard and how we look at that exposure that becomes very important. If you click, obviously, if we were faced with this, it would be a potentially very high hazard if we were standing in front of this tiger. But if you click again, there are obviously ways to control this hazard. You can put up a fence so that then if you click again, you basically have the ability to view the tiger and feel very comfortable that there's very negligible risk associated with enjoying this lovely creature. And if you click again, So risk really focuses on the likelihood that effects would occur, while hazard only considers that there could be an effect. So it's really critical of how we bring these two components together for chemicals, as well as anything that we look at in our life, in our daily life, or when we're trying to enjoy nature as well. Next slide. So we've already seen this framework here, and this is really the kind of the hallmark of a risk-based framework, and allows you to bring in these different components into a risk-based type of assessment. And I think we've heard from all the speakers the importance of understanding sources. Where are chemicals going to come from? How are they going to enter the environment? That really then will dictate the type of exposures that will occur. And then you have to look at that compared to any of the potential hazards. A good example on the environmental side is the presence in the environment alone is not equivalent to evidence of harm or evidence of risk. It is important, as we heard in the inaugural opening, to look at the concentrations. And then that also means having the methodologies to look at the concentrations of these chemicals in the different matrices. To enable really an effective decision-making to protect human health and the environment, this risk-based type of approach really needs to be employed, looking at both the exposure component and the hazard component, and having the tools that you need to really evaluate both of those aspects. Next slide. One way to approach this, because there are quite a few chemicals, and we heard that also in some of the opening talks about there are a number of chemicals in use, and they are all of them have very important types of uses and applications. So how do you go about really beginning to look at them? And if you look at the first aspect of being screening and prioritization, and how would you do that? If you click again, Betsy, you would look at the qualitative hazard. So you can go ahead and click again one more time. And this allows you to group a large number of chemicals. So you can take and screen across a large number of chemicals, really doing a qualitative hazard and exposure profiling based on maybe the existing data that's present. CSIR, so quantitative structure activity relationship predictions, phys-chem parameters, fate, etc., any types of information that you might have. And I'll show kind of a working example of this a little bit later. But it's really the data available at hand. And you look across this larger number of chemicals, and you can screen and prioritize and say, well, some of these might have high hazards, but there appears to be little exposure. So I'm going to not worry about those. Or there's high exposure and moderate hazard. So maybe I need to take it to the next level. And if you click again, then you can begin to do a preliminary quantitative exposure. This is some of the worst case sort of deterministic evaluations, where maybe you might do a very classic risk characterization ratio, or a PEC-PNEC type of evaluation with minimum type of data. And so you might have some standard tox tests, you might have some predicted exposures, but you don't really know the full extent of the exposures. So you kind of do a preliminary quantitative assessment. And then if you click again, you would go to a more detailed assessment. And this is often with field testing. So you might use weight of evidence, you might use mode of action, and complex exposure models that are validated with actual exposure data, where you might have data from the field, or you might have data from worker type of exposures that you can begin to input into the models. So you can see that you can start with, if you click again, it just means that then you're focusing in on a smaller group of chemicals that maybe you really need that detailed type of quantitative evaluation, and you're reducing your uncertainty. So maybe there's some uncertainty about, maybe there's a high hazard. So you really want to look very closely at it to make sure that there is no risk associated with it, with the exposures. So you want to reduce that uncertainty by going into more detail. But you can't do that with every chemical. And that's why this approach, this tiered type of approach, allows you to do some screening up front and kind of move some of the chemicals that you're less concerned about over to the side, and then bring the rest of them kind of down through this funnel to do a more detailed type of assessment on it. You go to the next slide. So this talks about some of the risk-based versus criteria or hazard-based, and Carlos mentioned this in his talk. This could be used in that sort of first tier that you're doing. So you might look at it and you say you have some toxicity testing, or you have some chemicals that meet PBT or POP type of criteria, or endocrine type of criteria. Now, if you wanted to do just a hazard-based type of assessment, you would take that information and just move to risk management. But you could be at risk then of eliminating a chemical that has very innovative uses and applications that really will further sustainability in the future. And that's important to take a look at. And you could also then be at risk really of removing something that or that would allow for a substitution of something else that could even have a greater hazard. So it's really a high level look, but it doesn't give you a lot of information. And sometimes it can give you even misleading information about a chemical when you don't go to that next level. So if you click again, Betsy. So now if you go to the risk-based type of assessment, it's taking that information. You're not ignoring that information, but you're bringing it into context with everything else now that you know. And it's kind of moving through those tiers of looking at, maybe I need to do a deeper evaluation. If I have a substance that meets these criteria, then maybe I need to look more closely at the exposure before I make a risk management based decision, or a hazard-based decision on risk management. So that's bringing in things like exposure, and that's looking at exposure modeling. And these are some of the topics that we can go into more depth and provide. How do you do these type of things? On what type of models can be used? What are some of the advancement in exposure modelings? There's been a significant advancement in quite a few exposure models. One of the other roles that I have is I chair the ICCA LRI Long Range Research Initiative for the chemical industry. And we have been working on developing exposure models to really deal with various types of chemicals, as well as looking at different scenarios like consumer use and various applications, and bringing them all together so that we have more advanced modeling. You can go out and do measurements. So you can actually go out into the environment and do measurements, or you could do measurements within the workplace. Wherever it is that you need to better define that exposure, there are tools. But as we heard earlier in the inaugural speech, it's very critical to have the right tools and the right methodologies and have them standardized, because you can also get wrong answers if you don't have those right tools and the proper methods. So it's always important to take a look at that. You can look at deterministic versus probabilistic. Probabilistic allows you to bring a lot of data together and really look across a variety of species, or looking across a variety of different matrices in the types of exposures that you would have. This allows you to go back and forth as well. Maybe you get to a point where you have a hazard, you have some exposure data or some exposure modeling, but you have some uncertainty there. So then you can go deeper and maybe get some additional data, whether it's field measurements or additional testing that's needed, and you can go back and forth in an iterative process, really, in this risk-based decision making, that allows you to make a better informed risk management decision as to what's the right path for this chemical. Is it really a complete ban, or is it limiting types of exposures, or is there really nothing that's really needed around that chemical because the exposures are very low and you will never realize the hazard associated with it? So that's the value really of taking the tiered type of approach, where you can work through these different aspects and bring in the data that's needed to make the decision really about the chemical. Next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about the weight of evidence. And this is something where we've had quite a bit of experience that have come in from working with our silicone materials. The risk-based weight of evidence approach really allows for evaluating all lines of evidence for both hazard and effects and exposures. And it really increases your reliability and your transparency. So it allows you to bring all the data. If you have a data-rich chemical, you can bring in every piece of data and really look at that lines of evidence and do this whole weight of evidence approach, which allows you to kind of line it all up. And there's a number of tools now that have been developed that allows you to kind of complete these weight of evidence, particularly around, for example, persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic chemicals. There are methodologies that help you look at, okay, if you have a chemical that's going to be found in the water, what aspect do you need to look at? If it's going to be found in the food chain, what aspect of bioaccumulation do you need to look at? And you can apply different weights. And this is something that we really have come to appreciate for our silicone materials, and that it's very critical. They have some unique properties associated with them that basically they behave very differently in the environment compared to some of the other chemicals. So this risk-based weight of evidence really allows us to take into consideration those unique properties of that chemistry set to really do a much better and a much thorough assessment of whether or not there would be a risk associated with their chemicals. And that leads to then a greater confidence in really the final risk assessment. So these are just some of the tools. And I think the risk-based weight of evidence, which really allows you to line up all of those, the aspects, particularly for a chemical that has quite a bit of data, is one of the very useful tools. And we can walk through that in a future webinar as well as to how do you do that. There's methodology out there. How do you evaluate each one of those lines of evidence? How do you look at the data to bring it into the lines of evidence as well? Next slide. So I just wanted to touch upon an example that hits upon the aspects of the risk-based weight of evidence that I've brought in here today, and that we can talk in more detail on and in our future webinars and our future workshops, hopefully in person. But this is Canada's approach to the environmental risk assessment, and it's very recent. So they've done a number of different iterations of it. It's called their Ecological Risk Classification, or ERC for abbreviation. And it's what they call as their confidence-based science prioritization approach for chemicals. And they completed it, the second iteration of it was completed in 2021. And it's expanded, it's now version 2. And they have a framework that really takes into consideration the toxicological properties of chemicals and the exposure space of the chemicals, while providing a more transparent weight of evidence approach. So very similar that I talked about on using the lines of evidence. They're really focused on evidence-based and bringing in some of these key components of a risk-based type of approach. But they also use quite a few different tools. And if you go to the next slide, it's just a conceptual version of the approach that they're using. But they basically will look at a number of tools to look at a hazard profile. So they may use CSIR, they may use in vitro data. They're trying to use the minimal amount of data to really screen in that first step of prioritization. But they'll look at the chemical's properties. So for example, do they know anything about the type of toxicity that's present and what might be the mode of action? And then they also combine that with also looking at the exposure components, and they may do exposure modeling, they may bring in any field measurements, and then they want to really start with the chemistry, connect it to the biology, and then really look at the importance of the mode of action. So it's bringing all of these pieces together to screen and really take a look at, do I even need to focus on this chemical? And do I need to spend a lot of time on doing a more quantitative risk assessment? So it's a very thorough process, and there are links available This was an overview that was provided by Mark Bonnell, who is their lead scientist in Environment Canada. And it's a very unique approach, really, to helping them screen and go through a large number of chemicals to then really focus in on doing the more detailed type of quantitative assessments. Next slide. So in summary, I think one of the things that we all go back to as toxicologists is Paracelsus, who was considered the father of toxicology. And one of the most important quotes that he said is, "All things are poisons, and nothing is without poison. Only the dose makes the thing not a poison." And I think one of the classic examples of this is even water. We all need water to survive, but yet water, if you drank an excessive amount of water, can also be a poison. And so it kind of puts in perspective the need for understanding the exposure component, that dose component. So in summary, if you click, a risk-based weight of evidence process really facilitates an assessment of both the quality of the data and the relevance of the exposure in causing these adverse effects. For those of us in the chemical industry, we do work with hazardous chemicals, but we have found ways to control those type of exposures. I heard reference to the ALARA as low as reasonably possible. And that's really critical. We've all found ways within the chemical industry, as well as in our daily life, to minimize exposure to hazards and any risks that might come from them. And the last bullet. So the regulations that are hazard-based and do not consider relevant exposure often restrict the use of very safe products, or trade one potential risk for another. And that's why it's so critical to really implement the risk-based type of approach in chemicals management to get a very thorough understanding of what you're dealing with from a chemical perspective, and ensuring that you're not going to replace it with something else that really has a greater risk. And with that, I look forward to our next series of workshops so that we can go into more details and provide more details on the different types of methodologies that we've been working with over the years. Thank you.
Ankit, your voice
So
is
you
not
are mute.
audible.
Ankit, you are mute.
Sorry, was there a
You're
question?
I'm not able to hear you.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, you are audible.
Yeah, so there is some echo at my end. Yeah, so thank you, Dr. Plodzi, for aptly summarizing and explaining the risk-based safety assessment frameworks, the difference between risk-based and hazard-based approaches, and the international approaches on environmental risk assessment. We will take a question at the end of this session. So if there are any questions, you may please post up in the chat box. Now we move to our next distinguished speaker, who is Dr. Vishal Chaudhary. Dr. Vishal is a Deputy Industrial Advisor at Department of Chemical and Petrochemicals. Dr. Vishal handles matters related to international convention, protocols in environmental health safety, chemical inventories, and he closely coordinates with MOEF on these matters. He also handles petroleum chemicals, petrochemicals, investment region policies, and its implementation. With this, I invite Dr. Vishal to deliver his distinguished address. Dr. Vishal, over to you, please.
Yes. Good evening. Thanks, Ankitji. And I'm highly thankful to NEERI for inviting me to this very important forum and the event, to giving to speak on this. And I'm also thankful to my department for nominating me and allowing me to speak in this important event. So are my slides available, Ankit ji, or should I think, is it available? My slides is visible?
Yes, the slides are visible. You can make it in a full screen mode.
Okay. Thank you so much. So actually that already Dr. Chitra ma'am and Dr. K. Prox ma'am, they have very nicely explained about the risk assessment analysis, and this theme of the main theme of this session is about the risk-based chemical assessment. But what I thought that I will just keep my talk it as a precursor to this theme. I will just give the brief idea about the chemical sector and the regulations and conventions which Government of India is complying, and we are or associated with the chemical commodity. So I will structure my presentation like that. First, very briefly, very quickly, I will give an overview of Indian chemical sector. Then the international conventions pertaining to chemicals to which Government of India is obligatory and signatory body. Then the leading segments of chemical sector, I will just skip up because it's more for industry. Because basically I'm, as told by Ankit also, I'm working as a deputy industrial advisor in the Department of Chemicals. So I'm working on the various policies which help industry to grow, which aims to help the chemical industry. Then I will just discuss on the global regulation about the scenario. What is the global scenario on chemical regulation, and what regulations, up to what extent of regulations are we following in our country. Then the how the sustainable development of the chemical sector can take place, taking place both economy and the environment hand to hand. Then there are certain initiatives which have recently taken by the Department of Chemicals, Government of India. That also I'll be briefing, and the way forward, how the way forward can be done for government, for the research institutes, and for the industry. So the sector scenario very quickly. See, chemical is the most important commodity of economy of any country. Not only our country, for any country, chemical is the most crucial and important commodity because it is the raw material supplier to all the sectors, be it agriculture, automobiles, construction, textile, healthcare, packaging. Almost all the sectors have presence of chemicals. It is commonly said that when we, in the morning, when we wake up, we use toothpaste, and till the entire day and the night after dinner, we have coffee. So from Colgate to coffee, everything is composed of chemicals. So chemicals are an integral part of our life. Such is the importance of that commodity. So when we say to regulate this commodity, we have to take
Dr. Vishal, sorry to interrupt. Your slides are not moving.
Oh, sorry, sir. Is it moving?
No. Actually, we can't see it on full screen mode. So probably you'll have to click the taskbar and then move.
I'll just
Yes, now it's moving.
Now is it visible?
It's unshared now.
Just one. I will again share. I think something is just 1 minute. Now is it visible, sir?
Yes.
Okay. So I was just speaking that importance of the chemical commodity and the chemical sector. So just very few, just one slide only for the stats and figures. We are the 6th largest globally in the chemical sales, and we are the 2nd largest manufacturer or exports of dyes and pigments, and 4th largest producer and exporters for agrochemical. This is the sector which contributes around 15% of India's exports. And the present market size of entire chemical industry, Indian chemical industry, is $212 billion, which is expected to reach $300 billion, considering a CAGR of 9% by 2025. So this is what I've already just told, that the sector also, one important point, the sector is employing around 4 million people at present, directly or indirectly. This is the demand and the growth projection till that 2025, it will be around $300 billion. On the right-hand side of the slide, if you can see, these are the sub-segments of the chemical, how the chemical sector is divided in the industry. We have the bulk chemicals, then specialty chemicals, then petrochemicals, then agrochemicals and fertilizers, and then biotech, pharma, and others. And among them, the specialty chemicals is the sector which is growing very fast. And at present, market share is 22%, but it is expected to reach at 30%. And it is about the specialty chemicals and the agrochemicals where the regulations, rules, and the risk assessment is majorly concerned. These are the two categories. This I will skip. This is the contribution of chemical sector to the manufacturing GVA of all these sectors. So all the sectors have the presence of chemicals, if you see this slide. Now the international conventions, the conventions which monitors the chemicals or through which the chemicals are regulated, or the regulatory compliances are being made by the Indian industry because of these conventions. The first one is the Stockholm Convention. It's, I mean, NEERI is already, I think, approved center for that also, for the analysis. This international treaty is about monitoring of persistent organic pollutants. And this government of India ratified this convention on 30th January 2006, as per the provisions of Article 25 subclause 4 of the convention. So the convention has three annexures, basically, three lists of chemicals. The annexure A is the elimination, which has 26 chemicals, and all the member or the signatory countries have to make the strategy or to take the measures to eliminate the use of production and use of such 26 chemicals. The annexures, another one is annexure B, which is restriction. And at present, two chemicals are there, and one of them is DDT. And I would just like to inform here that DDT is only India is producing DDT. Our PSU HIL, Hindustan Insecticides Limited, which is a public sector under the Department of Chemicals, only HIL is exempted or allowed to produce DDT for the specific exemption use, and that is for public health program, malaria control programs. Once when DDT was discovered, it is said that it was called as wonder drug during the early 80s and late 70s, because the malaria deaths have come down from 2 million to drastically less than 500,000 because of the use of DDT only. So because of that, DDT has got the specific exemption use. Then we have the annexure C, which are 7 chemicals, and it is monitoring their unintentional production or their unintentional release of the chemicals to the effluent or the environment. Now, role of Department of Chemicals in the Stockholm Convention is that since although the Ministry of Environment is a nodal agency for this Stockholm Convention and all that, but since the convention deals with the chemicals, so all the information data which is required is provided by Department of Chemicals to Ministry of Environment, which helped them to make a stand of the country regarding the issues which are being raised in the Stockholm Convention. And also there is always a department representative which attends the conference of parties along with the delegation of Government of India. Then another one is the Rotterdam Convention, which is also convention of chemicals. It is also a multilateral treaty, which is basically to promote and knowledge sharing basis of the hazards, probable hazards that can be posed by the chemicals. This convention has a procedure called prior informed consent procedure. Rotterdam Convention deals about those chemicals which are hazardous or which are restricted or prohibited in the Europe within their internal use. And if any country wants to export those chemicals to other country, or in other words, if Indian industry wants to import those chemicals into our territory, then there is a procedure in the Rotterdam Convention which is called prior informed consent procedure, wherein the exporting country has to take authorization from the designated national authority of the importing country. And that is a particular format is there, which is called that export notification, that which is being provided by European Chemical Agency under the Rotterdam Convention. And for industrial chemicals in the Government of India, the designated national authority is Joint Secretary, Department of Chemicals. I am dealing with that section. All these international conventions I am handling. So based on the information received on that export notification form, we see the intended use of chemicals, the credentials of the industry, then we give our recommendation. And based on that, the export from Europe or the import, in other words, import to India for those chemicals takes place. And it is a particular annexure called annexure 3rd, which is having the list of chemicals in the Rotterdam Convention. There are 52 chemicals, 35 pesticide and 16 industrial chemicals out of them. And for industrial chemicals, the application is being recommended by Department of Chemicals. For the pesticides, the application goes to Department of Agriculture, where the Joint Secretary, Department of Agriculture, is the designated national authority to recommend or to reject that. This is about that. Then again, the role of department, not only we provide information about these chemicals to Ministry of Environment, but also, as I already told, we give the clearances, we give the recommendation to the importing that Indian industry or the exporting party in the Europe, considering all these documents and the end use of the chemicals. Then there is Montreal Protocol, which deals with the HCFCs and their phased out plan. It came into force on 1st January 1989. Government of India is also that signatory to that. And this is also, there is a separate ozone cell has been constituted, already exists in the Ministry of Environment, which deals with all the issues regarding Montreal Protocol. And whatever data regarding to the chemicals required, it is provided by Department of Chemicals to them. Then the most important is Chemical Weapon Convention. It is a as you may be aware, it's a universal non-discriminatory multilateral treaty which governs or which talks about prohibition of development, production, stockpile, transfer, acquisition, and use of all chemical weapons or the chemicals which have the potential to be used as weapons. This Government of India is also signatory party to Chemical Weapon Convention. This is administered by an organization called OPCW, Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. Government of India signed this Chemical Weapon Convention treaty in the Paris on 14 January 1993. And as on date, 193 countries are signatory to OPCW, to the Chemical Weapon Convention. Only 4 countries are still left with, they have not signed, but 193 countries are already the members. As a part of treaty, all the members countries or the signatory member parties have to make a strategy to eliminate or to destroy the stockpile of chemical weapons, to prohibit the use of chemical weapons, and the precursor or the chemicals which have the potential to become chemical weapons, they have to give the declarations and their strategy for their minimum use. Chemical Weapon Convention Act, as a part of treaty, the Chemical Weapon Convention Act was notified by Department of Chemicals, Government of India in 2005. And for that, a separate authority called NACWC, National Authority for Chemical Weapon Convention, has been set up in Cabinet Secretariat, which monitors the filings and all the activities of Chemical Weapon Convention. But the Act, CWC Act of Government of India, is administered by Department of Chemicals. And whatever the gazette notifications regarding NACW, regarding OPCW or the Chemical Weapon Convention or the NACWC has to be published or notified, it is all notified by Department of Chemicals only. So in the Chemical Weapon Convention, there are 3 schedules of chemicals which have been annexed to this convention, and which all the signatory parties has to comply with, have to show the compliance. Schedule 1 has 16 chemicals which are totally prohibited as they are directly termed as chemical weapons. They have the direct potential to be used as weapons. Then there is Schedule 2, which has 14 chemicals. These are called precursor to chemical weapons. They are restricted. They have some certain restriction to the use in the quantity wise. Then we have Schedule 3, which have certain 17 chemicals. These are dual use chemicals. They are restricted for use more than 30 metric ton. Up to 30 metric ton, there is no problem. But if it is to be used on annually basis, more than 30 metric ton quantity, then the manufacturer has to give the annual declaration to the NACWC with a copy to Department of Chemicals. So there are 47 chemicals which are being dealt or governed or monitored by the Chemical Weapon Convention. Similarly, the 52 chemicals under Rotterdam Convention, and similarly 26 plus 7 plus 2, 35 chemicals in Stockholm Convention. So these are the chemicals which are the list of chemicals which are already under monitoring or under some rules or under some governance. And there is SCOMET policy, foreign trade policy of Government of India. In foreign trade policy of Government of India, all the dual use items have been given a nomenclature which is called as Special Chemicals, Organism, Materials, Equipment and Technologies. And that stands for SCOMET. Under this, there are around 100 chemicals, which are dual use, which can be used as industrial solvent or industrial reagents, and it can also be used as a weapons or weapon of mass destruction. And export of such chemicals, as per the export policy of Government of India, is restricted and is subject to a license which is given by DGFT based on the recommendations of Department of Chemicals. There is an inter-ministerial working group in the DGFT wherein all the concerned ministries are representing. I am representing Department of Chemicals in that group. And there's a list of chemicals such as comet atoms, around 80 or something is the number is there. If any manufacturer or the trader or a person wants to export any of the chemical of those 80 chemicals, he has to apply to DGFT for a license. DGFT will send his application to Department of Chemicals to us. We will examine, we will see whether the chemical is being used for the industrial or will it be used for a weapon mass destruction. Based on the intended use and the credential of the industry of both the parties, then we give our clearance, we give our recommendation to DGFT, not to the manufacturer. DGFT then issues the license for that particular chemical to the particular industrial manufacturer. This is the classification of the chemicals under SCOMET category. Category 1 is termed as chemicals under SCOMET. Yes,
considering the time limitation, would request you to wrap up in next 5 minutes, please.
Sure. I will just do very quickly. So this is just a different category. The export category 1A corresponds to the Schedule 1 of Chemical Weapon Convention. Then category 1B will be for the Schedule 2 and category 1C for Schedule 3. This is under the SCOMET items. These are the leading segments of the chemical industry, agrochemical and the dyes and pigments. These are the two sectors where we are the net exporters. Our government, Indian chemical industry is the net exporters in that. This I will skip because it is more of industrial use. This is the global scenario for regulation. We all know that the European Union initiated this exercise in 2006 with the REACH regulation, which was aimed to understand the possible hazard or probable hazard which chemical can pose to the that human health and environment. And after that, most of the countries like USA, Canada, Japan, Australia, China, they have established a REACH or the REACH like similar regulation in their countries. Now, present scenario in our country in India, we have Insecticides Act, which regulate pesticides, and around 950 pesticides are registered, both technical and formulation. Then we have Drugs and Cosmetics Act that regulate import, manufacture, and distribution of drugs. Then we have Environment Protection Act, under which two rules are there. MSIC rules 1989, which deals with the 664 that identified hazardous chemicals. And then CAPA rules, which is about the chemical accident preparedness. This is just 1-2 minutes I will give on this slide. The post-COVID strategy for the government, for the industry, and for the research institutes. There should be research done enough by the research institute which can be applied to the industry, that backward integration or the backward value chain can be covered. Suppose a product is to be manufactured like chlorpyrifos, which is a very interesting pesticide. The approach of research and the industry should be that should develop the process through the backward last value chain like PCL3 or PSCL3. So that within the same facility, industry can put up two or three different products like chlorpyrifos, profenofos, within the same. If we started with the PSCL3, with the DTCL route, it can be chlorpyrifos. With the 2-chlorophenol route, it can be profenofos. So such type of joint venture and the research is required. Then about the sustainable chemistry, I would just like to say that that green chemistry, sometimes industry say that the green chemistry is a very good concept, but how to apply in the industry, it's very difficult. It's very easy to do in the research labs and the institutes, but it's very difficult when we talk about the plant and the commercial level. So I suggest one example I will give, that there is a byproduct called spent acid, which is generated in almost all the pesticide industry. So this disposing of this spent acid is a very serious issue with the concern as per the environmental concern. So I suggest research institutes and R&D in the companies to look out this process, like simply this spent acid can be made reactive with cetyl alcohol or any other alcohol, and with the reaction with caustic lye, it can form a surfactant, which is a green product. I mean, it will not have any acid, and surfactant can be used for other pesticide products, making this wettable powder formulation. So such type of research process can be steps or the projects can be taken up by the research centers as well as the industry, so that the adaptation of green technology or sustainable chemistry can be achieved. These are the few initiatives which have been taken by the department. The department has established PCPIRs. Policy was notified in April 2007. So far, 4 PCPIRs have been notified in Gujarat, Visakhapatnam, Tamil Nadu, Paradip. The PCPIRs are a cluster-based approach, and around 250 square kilometer area has been notified for development of entire chemical industry only. Chemical and petrochemical industry will be developed only on these regions. My last slide, sir. Any major initiatives are recent taken by the department. The DCPC has set up an industry facilitation cell which takes up the issue and concerns of chemical industry with the concerned authority. Here we are also inviting the research institutes and the CSIR institutes also, so that if there are certain projects which are already successful at the lab scale or the pilot scale, and lab institutes feel that industry can take up those projects for the commercialization, then in the industrial facilitation cell, the CSIRs or the research institutes can share those projects with us. We'll tell the industry, and there will be a hand-holding type thing, and we will just make a common platform for the research institutes for the industry. That's the purpose behind that. Then we have an advisory forum. Then we have also set up project development cell, and then we have a scheme called Chemical Promotion Development Scheme, wherein we are organizing the knowledge dissemination programs, seminars, and conferences, and the studies also. And recently, we are planning to conduct one study about the deep sea discharge norms and the deep sea discharge limits for the pesticides and other chemicals. And we are also planning to rope NEERI into that, along with the sea marine salt institutes, to do that studies. So the way forward for all of us, to the industry, of the government, and to the research institutes, joint ventures, our research, advanced technologies, to all the stakeholders should come on the single board, and the government will also be there to help to formulate the friendly policies, so that both research centers, research institutes, and the industry gets benefited and country gets benefited. Thank you so much. Namaskar. Jai Hind.
Thank you, Dr. Vishal. Sorry for hurrying you up considering the time limitations. And I think when we have a detailed physical workshop, we can have and hear more of your thoughts on this.
Sure.
Thank you for presenting the sectorial views on chemical industry, statistics related to the chemical industry, and details of the international conventions, what it covers, what it doesn't cover, the global scenarios, and initiatives by DPCC and the way forward. Thank you very much for your distinguished address, sir. Now we move to the next session, which is a Q&A session. And I think we have a lot of questions on the chat box. Now I hand over the discussion and Q&A session to my NEERI colleague, Dr. Ramesh Kumar. Over to you, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much, Angit. I thank all the panelists, Dr. Chitra Rajagopal, Dr. Pulatsky, and Dr. Vishal Chaudhary for enlightening the participants regarding this science behind the risk-based assessment. So this is one important topic. We all know that chemistry and the chemical industries.
Dr. Vishal, can you unshare? Dr. Vishal, your screen is shared.
Oh, so sorry, sir. Yes.
Yeah. So chemistry as well as chemical industries are the backbone of the economy of any country. So the topic assumes more importance and significance. So at the same time, UNEP has released one global chemical outlook in the year 2019. So which also summarizes that chemicals as well as waste are deeply interlinked with all sustainable development goals. At the same time, more chemicals as well as waste will be released into the environment because chemical production is expected to double by the year 2030. So within this premises, all countries has to take actions to manage the chemicals efficiently. So when we come to manage the chemicals as well as waste, we have two approaches regarding the regulations. So we all aware that to manage these chemicals globally, almost all the countries are there tightening their rules, especially the chemical management and safety is concerned. So we have discussed about the science behind the hazard-based as well as risk-based approach of management of chemicals. So right now, most of the international regulations, chemical safety management regulations, including UNEP as well as SICAM, the strategic approach to international chemical management. Most of the agencies, their approach is based upon the precautionary principle. That is mainly the hazard-based approach. So today we have listened to good speakers regarding the science behind the risk-based approach. So obviously we have many questions today. So we will take the questions one by one. So let us start from the last speaker, Dr. Vishal Chaudhary. There is one good question to Dr. Vishal. In fact, I also asked the same question just last month. When this chemical management and safety rules, in short, India REACH is expected to implement in India. Yeah, Dr. Vishal, please. Yeah, it seems yeah, he's offline. So I asked the same question last month in a meeting at Delhi to Dr. Vishal. He told that right now interministerial consultation is going on. So there is no time limit is fixed to implement these rules. But anyhow, we can expect this rule to be implemented maybe in a couple of years. Yeah, thank you. So we will take up the other questions. The first question is Dr. Walter. Dr. Walter's question is, yes, the same question. So we'll move on to the next question. Which approach is used in Europe, whether it is hazard-based or risk-based? What is the rationale behind the approach chosen by EU? I think Dr. Plotsky can answer this question. Which approach is used in European Union and what is the rationale behind this?
So which approach is, yeah, used in Europe? Is that what what the question is?
Yeah. Which approach, whether it is hazard-based or risk-based approach, which approach is used in European Union and what is the rationale behind it?
Okay. All right. So, and I'd invite other Europeans because I'm not European, so I'd invite others too, but I'll start with, it's actually a combined approach. They do hazard review and screening, and they use a lot of tools that are hazard based, but they do obviously incorporates a risk-based approach as well. But they do put quite a bit of weight on some of those hazard properties. So it is a combined approach using hazard and risk, but they do put a lot of weight on some of those particular hazard properties like persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic that we talked about earlier. So, but I'll invite others from Europe to weigh in as well.
Yeah,
so
thank you.
Yeah, I think Oliver can. Yeah, go ahead, Oliver.
Is it okay to give a word? And maybe Oliver also can add to that. So that's Walter
Please,
from Wacker in Germany. So I think the basic line is the precautionary principle. So that is what the European regulators are following. So it's of course it puts a lot of focus on hazard, as Casey already explained, and the baseline of political and societal agreement is to follow the precautionary principle, which is of course one side of the coin, because everything has a risk and everything has a hazard. So take an airplane. Is it a hazard? Yes. Is there also a risk? Yes, of course, there is a risk associated to that. If you take a pharmaceutical, if you take a drug, it's highly effective chemicals, all pharmaceuticals, and they may be toxic. And the dose, which is another word for exposure, so makes it. And there's no pharmaceutical without a hazard, and there's no pharmaceutical without a risk. And the question is only, so what is a societal and political decision and regulatory decision in a regulatory area, how to handle that, and what is acceptable to society? Would you stop taking an airplane? No, you would not. Would you stop taking drugs because they also have a lot of benefits? No, you would not. And so I think this is what has to be considered. And this is why we believe that it's crucial to have a scientific approach which takes into consideration also the risk.
Yeah, thank you very much. We have two more questions on the same topic. Why hazard-based approach is sidelined in this webinar? And one more question, could you highlight the scenarios in which risk-based approach fail?
Yeah, risk. So let me just add a little bit on the hazard side. I don't think the hazard is completely sidelined. I think, and this comes back to the previous question about Europe and the precautionary principle as well. When you don't have a lot of data and you have something with high hazard, you may have to take a precautionary principle, right? You might not have the data to go on and do a full risk assessment. I think the key is when you have that data, or when there's, the willingness to generate that data, to get that data is really critical.
As a resource person. And I'm also very thankful to our organizing partner, GSC, and all the GSC executive and associated team members, especially Mr. Thomas Betsky, Mr. Balaji, and Jagmeet, for their continuous guidance and support to shape up this webinar. We have also been fortunate enough to be backed by a team of very motivated and dedicated students and volunteers. I thank them too. At the end, I would take this opportunity to thank all the members of the organizing team from CSIR-NEERI and the mentorship and steering from Dr. Ved. And I would also thank Dr. Goyal, Dr. Kumhare, Dr. Noor, Dr. Ramesh Kumar, Dr. Rita, and other staffs for their direct and indirect contribution and involvement in making this webinar a successful one. Thank you all, and good night and take care. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Good night.